Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. It's always about you if you're supporting Patron.com. Today's a really fun video lined up. We're going to be responding to Cosmic Skeptic's recent video, the first part of it on animal suffering. I have the dry apologist, Caleb, and Apologetics for All YouTube channel host, Joshua Yen. How's it going, guys?
I'm doing well, thank you.
I'm good.
Awesome. So I'm really pumped for this. We're going to look through the first part of this video before we respond to William Lane Craig. It's a good video by Alex on animal suffering. We're going to go through it. Do you guys want to give like really brief intros before we go into this response? Start with Josh.
Sure. Josh, you want to go?
I'm just glad to be here, I guess. It's a good morning in Hong Kong. Over here, I think it's probably night for you guys, but just, yeah, it's a good day. Glad to be here.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I had a discussion with Zach a while back on the problem of animal suffering, so I would definitely encourage listeners to listen to that as well, just so you have more context and my ideas on that. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I thought of Josh because Josh is amazing. He's always on the channel. And then Caleb because I did that interview with him a few months ago now on animal suffering and talked about that. But with that being said, we're going to just go right in and listen to this video. We're going to play the first part where he introduces the problem because Alex does a great job of doing that. And then we're going to specifically respond to the second part where he kind of defends the problem, so to speak. But we're going to get this thing going.
Now, I know that it's quite a bold claim that I've made in the title to have put my finger on the single biggest problem that Christianity as a religion faces. But let me explain. I want to put forward in this video what I think is the hardest objection to respond to if you're a Christian. Now, as you're probably already, the most famous problem you have, if you want to say that the Christian God, that is an all-loving, all-powerful God, exists, is the positively colossal amount of suffering infused into the human experience. Suffering is so omnipresent that most of our time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid it. Eating to avoid starvation, working to avoid poverty, sleeping to avoid fatigue, watching YouTube videos to avoid whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing right now. And that's when things are going well in life. God also throws into the bargain of living existence, which nobody agrees to enter into, by the way, unpredictable diseases, miscarriages, natural disasters, and the existence of TikTok. Why would an all-powerful God who truly loves us permit such suffering to overwhelm our living existence? And this problem for religion is called, as you'll likely know, the problem of evil. But there's something missing from this picture. I'm not just here to restate the problem of evil as if it's anything new. There's something else. There exists such an obvious and overwhelming version of the problem of evil that it bemuses me that so many philosophers leave it entirely out of the discussion, or at best relegate it to a passing paragraph or a footnote or something. I'm talking, of course, about the problem of animal suffering. Now, before you think I'm just getting all vegan on you again, don't worry, that's not what this is. I know how sensitive some of you are to me pointing out that our own treatment of animals is so poor that it almost reaches godlike proportions. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Animals suffering in factory farms, for instance, can easily be explained away by the Christian as a result of human free will. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about the suffering of animals that isn't human created. The suffering that exists in the wild as a result of natural processes. And by the way, the reason this video is called Christianity's biggest problem specifically, rather than just religion's biggest problem, is because I actually think that some other religions, like Islam, have bigger problems than animal suffering. But animal suffering is still a problem for other religions like Islam. So although in this video I'm going to respond to William Lane Craig, a Christian, on the subject, do bear in mind that these arguments should apply to any God who claims to be morally perfect. So this is the basis of my claim. If the problem of suffering is historically one of Christianity's biggest problems, then the problem of animal suffering is its biggest. So I should probably...
So what do you guys think of Alex's treatment of overall like the problem of animal suffering, introducing it? I think he does a pretty good job, but what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's fair to argue like that it's the biggest problem for Christianity, at least intellectually, because I hear that from others as well, and it is underaddressed compared to like human suffering. So I don't know if I necessarily agree that it's the toughest intellectual problem, but I can agree that, it's up there, so I think it's pretty fair.
I completely agree with Caleb. I think "Thank you, Jesus" might have solved the entire problem in the chat by saying, "What if animals don't have a soul?" But then, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think Alex. I actually have quite a lot of respect for Alex. He does do quite a decent summarizing of most different stuff in like the YouTube atheist realm, and I think he just does quite a good job summarizing the problem and also presenting it. And I do agree with Caleb when he says it is indeed like one of the biggest problems. Like suffering is always probably the biggest problem instead of argument, because sometimes I think that logically or like philosophically speaking, problem of evil and suffering isn't necessarily the strongest philosophical argument, but it definitely is the biggest, I think, emotional problem with Christianity as well at the same time. So I definitely agree with everything that's been said. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Alex does a good job of framing the problem, and as we get into this video, he does a good job of presenting it and making a compelling case for it. He's a good speaker and he makes good arguments. So yeah, it's definitely, and it's just, I think it's underdeveloped because a lot of the times, like Theodicies deal with like, why do us humans experience evil? And it's definitely something that's underdeveloped among like philosophers and stuff thinking about animal suffering. But if you guys don't have anything else to say, we'll kind of jump into this video. And then I have kind of like marks where I was planning on pausing. But if you want to pause a certain spot, just yell at me and I'll pause the video. And we'll get going if that sounds good to you guys. Splendid. All right, let's do it.
Probably begin by unpacking why animal suffering is such a problem worth addressing in the first place. Human life is, as I've argued, infused with pain. Then non-human animal life is defined by pain. Animals in the wild are subject to endless torment from all angles of their existence. They suffer from predation by other animals. Wild dogs disembowel their prey. Venomous snakes cause slow internal bleeding and paralysis. Crocodiles drown large animals in their jaws. Right? And animals also suffer from rampant disease, dehydration, and starvation. They have to contend with forest fires and floods and a whole manner of other terrifying natural disasters. David Attenborough, the celebrated nature documentary filmmaker, once said about his documentaries, "People who accuse us of putting in too much violence should see what we leave on the cutting room floor." Nature.
What do you guys think of this first bit where Alex kind of talks about just like there's just such like a high quantity of animal suffering and it's just such a common thing? Like, what are you guys' thoughts on this idea?
I think that that's fair. I think there is a concern, though, that sometimes I see people saying, like, well, there's just so many examples, but it kind of comes down to, I guess, one's theodicy overall, because, like, you can cite lots of examples, but if somebody doesn't see it as a problem, then having lots of examples isn't going to make it worse. But I don't have a problem with him doing that because, I mean, I think it is morally significant. I just think that there can be, you know, I can see where somebody thinks like, you know, citing numerous examples doesn't necessarily make it worse, like logically speaking, but that's the only thing I would point out, but I don't really have a problem with anything he said.
Yeah, completely agree with Caleb. I could say stuff later, I guess, when he develops a bit more.
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to, but I do think it's interesting to think about like what Caleb's talking about, because when we look at this problem, it's like, okay, well, let's say there's like 500 animals that suffer. Is that a problem? Or like 499 or 498 or 497 or 5 million? Like, it's hard to draw a line where it's like, well, if there's this many animals that suffer, then it's okay. So it seems like to me, at least when I think about the problem, it's just kind of like animal suffering as a whole, like that there are animals that suffer. Because I think it's hard to draw a line based off of the quantity of like, well, this would be an acceptable amount of animals that suffer. So keep on going.
Nature just really isn't a pretty place. And not only do wild animals suffer in these extravagant ways that humans generally do not, like having to live with the very real possibility of being more death at practically any moment, it's also true that compared to humans, an astronomically higher number of wild animals exist. So unfathomably high, in fact, that we can only estimate how big that number actually is. Number of wild vertebrates alone is thought to be somewhere between 10 to the power of 11 and 10 to the power of 14. That's 10 with at least 11 zeros after it. We're talking trillions of animals, each one of whom will, under the unerring supervision of an all-powerful, all-loving God, likely experience more fear, devastation, and suffering in their lifetimes than we human beings are even capable of imagining. So this is the problem that the Christian has to.
So do you guys think that the quantity of animal suffering like weighs any like weight with in terms of like the argument? Like it probably doesn't from like a logical perspective, but maybe like from like a more like evidential perspective. Do you think it carries any weight with like the quantity of animals that are suffering?
So I don't really think the quantity does necessarily, kind of like what we were just talking about, because like you said, like where do you draw the line? Like is 1,000,000 morally different than 1,000? But I do think I can definitely see from like an evolutionary standpoint, like at some point you could say like, well, why would God allow millions of years of it? But then again, it just comes down to like what one's view is. I don't think that the number is that significant. I think it's more of, kind of like we were just saying. I don't know that the number makes it that much significant, but I can see why it could seem that way.
Yeah, actually, I think I kind of like feel that even if it was just one animal suffering, it would be sufficient to prove his case. It's like something what Dostoevsky says in the Grand Inquisitor, where Ivan says, even if there's only one kid which gets torn to pieces by dogs, I would say that's sufficient for me to reject the ticket to God, like even if God existed. And I think that is perhaps the best way to put it. Like, what's the point in saying there's 1,000,000 people suffering? If animal suffering was truly such a big problem, shouldn't just one person suffering that significantly already demonstrate the point already? Like, it's not like, yeah, maybe there's 1,000,000 other people suffering, but like one person suffering on your argument is already sufficient for your argument to work, I think. And then that's why we raise Theodicies. Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it might like the quantity of animals may help like the evidential weight, but in terms of like the logical problem, I don't think it really does much work. But we'll keep going here. Spartan Theology, Danny, thank you, Jesus. Everyone who's joined us, thank you so much.
Has to contend with. How can God permit such insidious levels of unthinkable suffering? Well, it's not like Christians don't have a response to the problem of evil. There are many quite famous attempts to reconcile the existence of evil with a loving God. The problem is that a great many of these attempts, which are known as Theodicies, by the way, simply don't apply to non-humans. For instance, one popular theodicy states that evil and suffering exists as a result of human free will. Right? If humans are genuinely free, they'll sometimes commit and permit evil. But this doesn't explain why a tree falls onto a deer's leg, causing it to starve to death in confused agony. Right? It's also sometimes asserted that human suffering is justified because it will be compensated for in the afterlife. But unless you believe in some doggy heaven, or that Jesus died for the sake of your pet hamster's sins too, this also doesn't really fly for animals.
What do you guys think of this part of Alex's video? I think it gets a little bit more interesting here. It might be helpful. I know, at least for Caleb, you have kind of like a unique theodicy when dealing with these things. So feel free to like introduce that if you need to as well, Caleb.
Yeah, there's a lot of different areas because like he is fair to point out that like some of the more standard theodicies don't apply directly, but it's not really fair because there have been attempts to apply those theodicies to animal suffering, like the free will theodicy. Like whether you find it plausible or not, there are defenders who argue that like the free will of fallen angels are the cause of natural evils. And I think that's not the theodicy I prefer, but there are some more plausible ways of defending that theodicy that would be able to account for animal suffering. So it's a little bit unfair. And then he also says like, well, unless you believe in a doggy heaven. The thing is, though, that there have been notable Christians who have defended an animal afterlife. Like, for example, so I have a quote here from John Calvin. This is before evolution and such. He said, in regards to Romans 8, Paul does not mean that all creatures will be partakers of the same glory with the sons of God, but they will all share in their own manner in the better state, because God will restore the present fallen world to perfect condition at the same time as the human race. So that comes from Calvin's commentaries on the epistles of Paul on Romans and Thessalonians, and that can be found in Michael Murray's book, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw. And then there are other examples too, like John Wesley. I recommend somebody read, you can find this online. He has a sermon called The General Deliverance. He makes it very clear that animals will be a part of the afterlife to compensate for their suffering. And again, these are people that are writing quite a long time ago. And there are major philosophers like Trent Doherty, C.S. Lewis considered it. I mean, there are defenders, David Bentley Hart, there are defenders of an animal afterlife. It hasn't been the majority position, but it's not a ludicrous idea that, you know, God's going to recreate the new heavens and new earth. And we find that like in Romans 8, Isaiah 11. It's not implausible at all that animals will partake of the afterlife. So if that's, you know, Cosmic Skeptic seems to imply that's a plausible response. It's just that Christians don't defend that. That's just not true. I mean, there have been major Christian thinkers who have defended that idea. So I'll let Josh go.
Yeah, God has his own pets in heaven, also known as the angels and the cherubim. But yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree. It depends on the theodicy you raise. And like, what I like to think sometimes about the natural evil is that like, you could see natural evil causes certain problems, but at the same time, natural evil is a result of other things which kind of help humanity. It's like, okay, there's a flood, like some animals drown to death or their houses are destroyed. Well, what caused that flood? That's because there's rain, and rain kind of rained a little too much. But then what also does rain do? Rain also provides food for your crops, or I mean, water for your crops, and also like avalanches, or use as an example, a tree falling on a deer's leg or something like that. What caused that? Well, that's gravity. Well, aren't we all quite lucky that gravity does exist? Otherwise, we'd be floating up to space, if you get what I mean. It's like, yeah, the natural disasters caused by natural laws are indeed like problematic, but at the same time, the natural laws are necessary to sustain human life. So it's like, is human life better, or even animal life better than the suffering which is caused by the disasters? Like, I think there's like, you can't just say I want the good things from the laws, but then like I'm not going to accept the consequences for the same laws which like sustain you. So I think there's like quite a good balance there, if you got what I mean.
Mm-hmm. I read an interesting paper from it was Josh Rasmussen, and I have it here. It's linked down below for people that are listening. I don't have the other author on. It's in the Josh Rasmussen. Someone else wrote a paper in 2014 on evolutionary evil and kind of like what's going on with this problem. And they talk about a lot of these different like philosophers who would agree with some sort of like an animal afterlife. And like there's people that would argue, like John Polkinghorne, who says that a world allowed to make itself through the evolutionary exploration of its potentiality is a better world than one that could proceed by a ready-made divine fiat. So it's just interesting here because I think that I mean, I don't think Alex like thinks that no Christian has ever attempted to answer this problem, but there are a lot of Christians, like as Caleb was talking about, that have dealt with this problem of animal suffering. But a lot of the theodicies have to either be modified or thought about differently with regards to like animal evil versus like natural evil, especially regards to like the free will defense or something like that.
Yeah, and that's also where I'll follow up on. You had mentioned my theodicy earlier, and I know not everybody will necessarily agree with me, and I'll just defer to our discussion, Zach, and then I have a video on my channel that I recommend people watch, but I have a specific theodicy where I argue why, you know, the laws of our universe do bring about suffering, and it's more complicated. I don't have time to explain, but basically I give a causal explanation as to why. So if somebody's wondering, like, well, why don't we live in that heavenly universe now? You know, I have a worked out theory for that. So, and obviously, you know, Cosmic Skeptic's not taking that into mind because he's probably not watched my video. He probably doesn't know who I am, but okay.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Alex, if you're listening, you should know who Caleb the Dry Apologist is. But if there are questions related to animal suffering that you guys have as you're listening to this live, feel free to ask. We'll hit a few if they're related to like animal suffering on the way out. But you guys have like any thoughts you want to add before we go on to this next little bit of what Alex has to say? Splendid. Keep on going.
It's also sometimes said that suffering exists because from it more good can emerge. But what good emerges from animal suffering? And how does it benefit animals? Most animals are non-rational creatures, can't learn, intellectually grow in the same way that humans can. What greater good could possibly be served by allowing a koala bear to be burned alive in an Australian wildfire? Well, fear not, because
I think this is the last bit of the video that we'll specifically respond to, because then the rest of it is kind of like a response to William Lane Craig. But what do you guys think about the question of what good is allowed by God allowing these like animal evils, and especially gets into like these very intense instances of evil? So what are your guys' thoughts on this question?
Yeah, And Josh, feel free to disagree with me on this if you do, but I actually don't, and I've talked to Zach about this in the past, I don't think appealing to greater goods coming from animal suffering is going to be the most plausible approach. I mean, it's certainly possible, like under skeptical theism or something, that there is some greater good that we're not totally aware of. But I mean, I agree basically with William Rowe's argument that it seems like pretty unlikely that every instance of suffering, particularly animal suffering, is going to bring about some direct good. And that's why the theodicy I defend doesn't appeal to that. Not all theodicies do. So yeah, so I mean, I would concede, yeah, I don't think there is a particular greater good. I think we live in a fallen world where there aren't greater goods that come from every event, but God has a sufficient reason for that. Again, I defend that with my own theodicy, but there are different theodicies. But there are defenders who will argue that there are these greater goods that come, and it just depends upon what theodicy you're attracted to. But that's how I would respond, though. I just would say that's just a non-issue for certain theodicies.
I mean, I guess in response to that, and I guess I saw some comments in the comment section as well. It's like, yeah, I would agree that I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm just completely appealing to the greater good. Instead, perhaps it's just saying, well, these laws of nature are what allow humans to live. Like, regardless of what, perhaps I could have phrased it better. Perhaps I should say just laws of nature are required for the functioning of the universe. And then from that, you could perhaps see that, well, these functioning laws lead to both natural disasters or just human life. I mean, you could have either of them not like being good or bad or whatever, right? But like, I think at least to some degree, you would suggest that, well, existing or perhaps human existence is just as important, and I guess this leads to the greater good thing, but then you would perhaps suggest that animal and human existence or life as a story itself is at least as balanced or as equal to the suffering in this world. Like, I mean, yes, it is appealing to some sense of greater good, but I mean, the fact that we're alive, like, you could perhaps ask the question, well, would you rather not be alive and have just never existed at all, even if like there's some big suffering? And I think that there's some response. Danny in the comments said something like, laws don't explain accidental events. I think they do, in the sense that the deer example, if a tree falls down on someone's leg, or that would be a result of the laws of nature, if you get what I mean. Like, the law, I find it very hard to see how you could have gravity and these laws without having a tree fall down, and it's very hard to see why you could have a tree fall down, but also ensure that necessarily nothing is underneath the tree at the same time, right? Like, I think it's very difficult to suggest that you could have these laws of nature, but then not accept the full consequences of the laws of nature. And of course, I would allow someone to get out of my theodicy by just saying, well, let's just rather have humans not exist at all, and I'm happy with that. But like, if you have the opportunity of humans existing and suffering happens, or humans do not exist and then there is no suffering, then, I mean, if they accept the second hypothesis, sure, let them accept it. But then I don't see why one hypothesis is any worse than another hypothesis, if you got what I mean. Mm-hmm. Just like as a balance.
There's an interesting theodicy in the paper that I was reading today with Josh Rasmussen and this person, I can't remember his name. What's his name? Because he's Jordan Westling, and they're talking about animal suffering. And one of the like ideas they come up with, which is something that's in like the literature, is the idea that creation through evolution allows for interconnectedness among animals and people. So it's a really interesting idea that I hadn't thought about much before, but it says that it helps us tie our identity in part due to like our biological ancestry. Because if you think about it, in that sense, like animals, humans, in some sense with the tree of life, we'd all be related to some degree. Because it would also argue like that something beautiful occurs when creation occurs in like a law-like manner with structure and order, like Josh was talking about. And I think Caleb would agree with, like, when you have an orderly universe, it's just simpler and more beautiful. And I think it's just an interesting idea that kind of have this idea that we could be tied back into the cosmos itself. So another kind of like interesting theodicy with regards to like animal suffering and such. Do you have anything you want to add, Caleb? Because I mean, this is kind of the end of the part that we were going to respond to here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I don't have a lot else to add. I would just, yeah, I mean, I think Cosmic Skeptic did a good job presenting his position, but it is kind of like a real cursory overview. I mean, there actually has been a decent amount of literature written recently on this topic. Like, I'd recommend books like Trent Doherty's book, The Problem of Animal Pain, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw by Michael Murray, Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering by B. Kyle Keltz. I don't totally agree with everything that they argue, but like those are all pretty in-depth books that offer different theodicies and responding to animal suffering. And of course, I have my own theodicy that I wrote a short self-published book on responding to animal suffering, and the video on my channel again that summarizes it. And and then, but yeah, it's just I feel like he deals with it kind of at a real cursory overview, which is fine. I mean, he's introducing it, but I would really want to see him hash this out more in depth, because like he throws out like the heaven theodicy. Now, I don't think that would totally solve the problem of animal suffering, but it almost sounds like he's saying if somebody believes in an animal afterlife, that would basically largely respond to it, but people just don't believe in that. But the thing is, there are major thinkers who do defend that idea, so I really want to see him engage with that. I would love to debate him on this topic, but again, like I'm a nobody, but like really, yeah, the video is just very cursory overview, and I hope people don't just stop with this video and then that's it. So,
Do you have anything you want to add, Josh?
Caleb, if you're a nobody, I think my channel is like a quantum particle or something like that. But yeah, I think I completely agree with Caleb. It just depends on your approach with Theodicy. And I don't think, yeah, just basically that. Also, I'm quite curious, are we going to hear a bit about your Theodicy as well, Caleb? Or
Yeah, I think it'd be good here. I was going to say, because we're kind of done responding, I think, to Alex here. So we could kick his face off the screen and put Caleb front and center here. And we could just talk about like your theodicy with regards to the problem of animal suffering. So what's your theodicy, Caleb?
Yeah, I'll explain it, but I know that there are a lot of objections to it, and that's why I kind of hesitate, because it takes a little while to go through all the objections. But I did recently debate Non-Alchemist on it on his channel, so I'd recommend that as well. But basically the way that theodicy works is that I argue that in creating, any universe is going to necessarily have this system of physical laws, in that God, being the creator of the orders that system of laws according to his intellect and will. But if he was to fully conform the system of laws perfectly to his fully to his intellect and will, it would bring about this universe that we imagine with like the new heavens and new earth, where there's no suffering, that Christians, hope that have hope that God is going to bring about one day. But it would also be a world in which humans are morally perfect, and they would have to love God and love one another, which is, of course, is a very good thing. But I argue that people need to have the opportunity to freely decide if they want to enter into that kind of relation or not. So in order to achieve that setting, God has to create our initial universe, our pre-heavenly universe, with a system of laws that's only partially conformed to his intellect and will. But if the system of laws is only partially conformed to his intellect and will, then that's going to open the door to being things that God doesn't fully desire. And since God does desire for there to be animals in the new heavens and new earth, there's also going to be animals and humans in this pre-heavenly universe. So you're still going to have a lot of the same general features and such, but again, some of the particular features that are brought about through the evolutionary process and so on, there's going to be natural evils and such, again, because the system of laws is only partially conformed to God's intellect and will. And then that's just going to really, that leads to basically what Christians affirm, that we live in a fallen universe. So I know that's a lot to unpack, and there are a lot of objections. And again, I go through those with Non-Alchemist and then on my video, and I hope to write more about it, but that's the gist of it.
One objection I just have really brief for you, Caleb, not necessarily related to animal suffering, but with regards to like the unborn. So like, how do you think about like the question of like the unborn and like them not getting this chance in this life to kind of like freely choose between God or not?
Yeah, that's a great point, and that I think is the strongest objection to the theodicy, and that's the one that non-alchemists and I probably have the biggest, or at least that seems to be his biggest hang-up. And the way I would respond to that is that, so in creating, God is still intending for the universe to not have suffering when he creates with this partial conformity. So any of the suffering and death and stuff isn't God's intention. But the whole point is that God intends for everybody to be able to have this opportunity for a free choice in how they respond to God's offer. So there are, of course, people who die before they're able to make that choice, but that's not God's intention. So in ethics, there's this principle called double effect, where if a bad consequence comes about, but it's not your intention, then that person is not culpable for that side effect, assuming they were aiming for a greater good. So God's not intending for anybody to die, let alone people to die young. That's just an unfortunate side effect. So it really comes down to God's intention, and his intention is for everybody to be able to have that opportunity. It's just to make that free decision, but unfortunately not everybody gets that opportunity. But then it's not like God is going to then be able to push people away from heaven. Their soul, I argue, isn't going to have any sort of causal barrier. So, a child dies, their soul is going to go to live with God. So you could say that is a forced relation, but that's not God's intention. And then that really gets into the weeds of the principle of double effect, but that's how I'd respond.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything you want to add to this, Josh? Because we're kind of near the end of the road here with regards to like Caleb's Theodicy, or just anything you're thinking of with regards to animal suffering in Alex's video?
I mean, I think we could return to the point that, thank you, Jesus, rose at the beginning of the thing, which is, what if animals don't have a soul? Problem solved. Because I do think it has perhaps a bit more merit and is perhaps more simple than most things. Because I guess I think with the problem of evil, what the atheist tries to do is tries to grant the Christian hypothesis, and then from the Christian hypothesis demonstrate there's a problem with it. But then just imagine a possible Christian hypothesis. Doesn't have to be the one anyone subscribes to, but imagine there's a possible Christian hypothesis where animals are not at the same level, or do not have the same worth as humans. And then imagine if you grant that hypothesis, then even if there's way more animals suffering in the world, if the animals' worth themselves are significantly less than humans' worth, then perhaps the suffering that animals face in large is actually significantly less, if you want to compare suffering wise to humans, even though there's technically more suffering. Perhaps, I don't know how you measure pain, but imagine you have 1 million units of animals suffering and 5 units of humans suffering. Perhaps if perhaps that if animals are have less worth, then while that pain, although it has more units, each of those units are worth less. It's like having maybe 100 pennies, and then you have like a $1,000 note or something like that. Like the amount of pennies is significantly, although there's more, is actually less than the $1,000 note. So I think that's also perhaps another way you could go around doing it, by just saying, well, animals worth less, and hence their problem of suffering is less significant. Not necessarily the owl. I think that's the best theodicy to go around it, because I mean, people might not like that premise, but I mean, I think it is definitely a possible response, if you get what I mean.
I think that oh no, feel free to add, Caleb.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, it sounds like that point about animals not having, now I think animals do have souls, of course. I think that any living thing has a soul, but they don't have a rational soul, would be at least the traditional Aristotelian perspective. But anyways, but it kind of gets into it sounds like it gets into the neo-Cartesian or neo-Thomistic hypothesis that animals don't have enough rationality or consciousness to recognize they're in pain. And of course, William Lane Craig defends that type of view, at least for most animals, and Cosmic Skeptic criticizes him for that, or criticizes that view. And I don't think, so I think that, and I'm not saying, Josh, I'm not saying you're defending that view, but I think that view gets unfairly written off, because we don't necessarily know that animals are in pain, but we do act like they are. And that, I think, is Alex's point. It's not like you're going to go torment an animal, and he's saying, well, why not? And it's because we do think that they do suffer some amount of pain. So I do think that hypothesis is difficult to defend. I mean, even if you want to say animals don't have souls, I don't know that it then becomes. I don't know that that gets us out of the weeds really, but I understand, Josh, you're saying that maybe their suffering is less, and I mean I would agree that humans have more value than animals, but I do still think there is moral significance in their suffering. But
Yeah, perhaps I could also respond to something that Spartan Theology said somewhere up there in response to my first thing about natural law. It was something that, like, what did he say? He said God could make the laws of nature whatever he wanted them to be, right? And I think there was something following from that which says something about, like, well, maybe these natural laws, like, you could have natural laws but not explain certain disasters. I mean, I think I'll disagree with that because, as I've said before, I think it's very difficult for God to have gravity and then not have a tree fall, or at the same time, or another way, it's perhaps quite difficult for God to create, because if God creates another set of laws, perhaps, then you have to be open to another set of reality, another set of the universe, right? Like the what is happening in the world would be very different if God changes the natural laws. And I'm not saying humans will not survive in another universe. I'm sure God could create humans in a way that they could survive in another universe, but at the same time, maybe that universe will also have different forms of suffering. Instead of deers getting crushed by trees, they're actually floating in the sky, and then the tree comes up from the ground and hits them in the head, and then they fall down into the ground and then dies. Like, I mean, there perhaps in like another natural law, there's also another problem. So, like, I think that just to say, well, natural laws, we just want some natural laws to support some good things or just support life, but then at the same time, like, there is some other problems which come from the natural laws. I mean, like, you have to say, well, you can't make your cake and eat it as well. Like, you can't just say, well, I want some parts of the laws and I don't want the other parts of the laws. Like, some things do happen as a result of laws. And, like, there's another thing which said, the notion of fall contains the concept of gravity. Okay, let's just imagine a world without gravity. I'm sure, like, perhaps, like, you could have a tree flying around without gravity in a random, like, axis, and it just hits a deer, and by concussion the deer dies or something like that, right? Like, no matter where you look at it, I think you'll ultimately realize that random problems can happen under different circumstances, and I think it's wrong to just say, well, I don't really like those laws, or I don't really like those circumstances, therefore there is like no reason to say that animals suffering from this law. What am I even saying? I lost my train of thought. But I'm just saying that, like, you can't just have, like, laws and then, like, not have the consequences. There are consequences to everything, if you got what I mean.
yeah, well, I agree with you. Yeah, there's going to be any law-like universe is going to have unavoidable consequences from those laws. I do think it's a fair point to ask, though, like, if God's going to create a new heavens and new earth that is a physical reality, or even if it's somewhat immaterial, it still seems like I'm hoping that's going to be a world that there's not going to be suffering at all. So that is a point, I think, where and I'm not saying you can't address that, but I think that maybe is where they're coming from. And I think it's conceivable God could create a world with laws but no suffering, and that's kind of where I try to go with my theodicy. But one other point I wanted to raise is that there are some Christians who defend a view that God's not a moral agent at all, and he has no obligation. So anything like the problem of suffering just wouldn't touch their view. Now, I disagree with those Christians, but that is a view. They would watch Alex's video and say, well, that doesn't affect their view. And some Thomists and probably some Calvinists take that perspective. Again, I don't agree with it, but it is important, since he's saying this is a problem for Christianity. Well, there's a large group of Christians that would just disagree with his premise right off the bat. But I think it's just important to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think with animal suffering, we have to realize, like, there's a lot of options on the table for the Christian in terms of, like, answering, like, different theodicies and such. So it's not like Alex is trying to make it sound like Christians are just, like, left speechless, but I think there are a lot of options out there for the Christian. Even there's, like, just even reading this paper that I read today by Josh, it was like, wow, there's a lot out there that's thought about. This is not something that is new in regards to, like, the problem of evil, though it's obviously, like, underdeveloped compared to, like, probably, like, more human-based evils. So yeah, guys, if you don't have anything else to cover here, we can start to wrap things up, unless you want to add anything else with regards to animal suffering.
I don't have a lot else. I see somebody said they were interested in debating me, yeah, I mean, I'll debate anybody, so, but sure.
Anytime, anywhere, Caleb is ready to show up. They can DM you on Twitter, I guess, if people want to get in contact with you, Caleb. Is it the best way?
Yeah, they can DM me or leave a message on my channel or whatever.
Caleb's like the Mike Tyson of Christian apologetics, where he'll just go fight anyone, anytime. So respect to Caleb. But Caleb and Josh, thank you so much for joining me. Do you guys have like final thoughts you want to share? And then feel free to like share how people can follow you guys. You both deserve a lot more subscribers than you have now. You guys are growing, so feel free to share.
If Caleb can be contacted on Twitter, I think I might be the least tech savvy person in this room right now. I could only be contacted by email, or if you reply to the comment section of my videos. I actually have 0 places where you could reach out to me, so I think I might have to get better on the tech front. Yeah, like if you want to find me, I just check out Apologetics for All. I also have a book called Christianity for All, which is basically a guide to Christianity and stuff like that. You could go check that out. And yeah, just if you enjoyed the content I normally talk about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, then just go check my channel out. That's what I mainly talk about on my channel. So yep, that's basically it from me. Thanks for having me here, Zach. Always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed this discussion. And yeah, if anybody has any questions or anything, they can always message me some way or another. So
yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for coming on. And Thank You, Jesus was reading your book. Josh Yen has a book. It's a good book. I started reading it too, actually. So, and I think Caleb's an author as well. So I think your book's out of stock on Amazon. So it's kind of sad. But thank you so much, both of you guys, for coming on today to talk about animal suffering. Alex, your video is great. If you're somehow listening to this channel with like 2,000 subscribers when you have like 400,000, I hope you enjoyed, and it was just a fair criticism. But it was a lot of fun, and I appreciate both of you guys for coming on. I appreciate Thank You, Jesus, Kelvy, Little YEC, Spartan Theology, Danny, everyone else who came in today. And if you enjoyed the channel, please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics. Your support means a lot to me, so you can do that, and I'd appreciate it. Or you can just become a member on YouTube. Just press the join button. But also be sure to subscribe to Apologists for All and Dry Apologist channels. So thank you guys one last time for coming on. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a good one, and God bless.